They told me not to eat much that day, as if my hunger was a fault I had to hide. "So you'll eat less," they said, with that half smile that never quite reaches the eyes, the one that feels like a punishment disguised as care. But the truth was, they starved me all day. I watched them eat around the table, the clinking of cutlery sounding sharper against the silence that settled over me like a heavy fog. I was there, but not there. Invisible, an afterthought, a ghost in the house where I had lived so many years. I was 79 years old and living alone now, in a small rented room behind a stranger's house where the stray dog I rescued waited every afternoon by the gate, hopeful for the scraps I could spare. I fed that dog with the groceries they barely let me touch, and in feeding him, I fed a part of myself that was starving in ways no one ever noticed or acknowledged. I remember that morning with piercing clarity, how my daughter's voice had that clipped edge as she told me what I was allowed to eat, the portion sizes strictly measured, as if I were a child or a patient in a hospital. They insisted it was for my own good, that my health depended on it. But health, I learned, could be used as a weapon, a way to control without admitting cruelty, to starve without confessing neglect. That day, the house was filled with the smells of roasting chicken and fresh bread, scents that teased and mocked the emptiness inside my own plate. The children laughed and passed dishes, the table bustling with warmth and noise, all of it leaving me colder than any winter wind that ever brushed the window panes. They never looked at me, not really. And when my eyes sought theirs, I was met with avoidance or irritation, as if my hunger embarrassed them. I had once been the one to prepare these meals, to set the table and keep everyone fed, and now I was reduced to watching from the edges, a silent watcher in a scene that no longer included me. There were moments that day when I considered speaking up, when I thought maybe if I asked, pleaded even, someone might notice the hollow ache inside me and reach out with kindness. But those moments passed quickly, swallowed by a lifetime of knowing that my words would be dismissed or twisted, that asking would make me a burden, a troublemaker, a woman who could no longer manage her own needs. Instead, I found solace in small acts of quiet rebellion, slipping a crust of bread under the table to the dog who had started visiting my window each afternoon, sharing with him what I could not have. Feeding him became a ritual, a way to claim some measure of agency in a house where my voice had grown faint and my body felt more like a vessel for neglect than a person deserving of care. I was no stranger to hardship. Life had worn its marks on me, lines etched deep by years of work, loss, and resilience. But nothing had prepared me for the slow starvation of being present yet unseen, fed yet left hungry in the company of those who should have been my family. The contrast between the abundance around me and the scarcity I was forced to endure was a wound that festered in silence, a quiet violence that chipped away at my sense of worth and belonging. I was 79 years old, with hands that had cradled generations, a heart that had given everything, and a spirit that still flickered despite the coldness that surrounded me. Yet in that house, with its locked pantry and whispered judgments, I felt myself shrinking, becoming less and less until I was almost nothing. Now, living alone with Mercy, the dog I had saved from neglect, by my side, I am learning to rebuild what was broken. The groceries I buy with my own money fill my small kitchen with sense of nourishment and comfort, reminders that I am still here, still capable of choosing for myself. Feeding Mercy is more than caring for a creature in need. It is an act of reclaiming my dignity, a quiet declaration that I refuse to be starved into silence. My story is not unique, but it is mine, and in sharing it, I hope to give voice to the countless women who have been diminished by those closest to them, who have endured the slow erosion of love disguised as care. Hunger is not always visible. It is not always about food. Sometimes it is the hunger for respect, for recognition, for the simple humanity that too often gets lost in the shadows of family life. As I sit here now, in this modest room that is mine alone, with Mercy curled at my feet and the evening light filtering softly through the window, I hold on to the truth that emerged from the emptiness of that day, that no one has the right to starve you, not of food, not of love, not of presence, and if they try, you must find your own way to feed the parts of yourself they have tried to wither. For me, that way was in the quiet eyes of a dog who understood hunger without words, in the small kindnesses I could still offer and receive. This is where I begin to tell my story. A story of starvation, yes, but also of survival, of resistance, and of the slow, steady return to life. The moment I realized something was truly wrong was the day they told me there wasn't enough food to go around. It was a quiet morning, the kind that starts with the slow creak of floorboards and the distant hum of the television downstairs. I was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for breakfast, hoping for a bowl of oatmeal or at least a warm cup of tea, something to steady my shaking hands and ease the ache in my joints. Instead, my daughter stood in the doorway holding a small plate with a sliver of boiled chicken and a few wilted greens. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, neither pity nor warmth, but something colder, something that felt like judgment wrapped in obligation. "There's only so much chicken today," she said quietly, almost as if she was confessing to a crime. "The kids had seconds. You'll have the soup." I nodded, though my throat tightened, and I swallowed down the lump that rose in my chest. Soup was thin, watery, barely more than hot water with a few floating pieces of carrot. I spooned it slowly, tasting the faint bitterness, and tried not to let my eyes stray to the table where the rest of the family ate in lively chatter. Full plates steaming with food I was no longer entitled to. This was not an accident. I understood that then with the sharp clarity that only betrayal brings. It was a calculated omission, a deliberate decision made behind my back, with whispers exchanged when I wasn't looking and closed doors behind which my name was spoken in tones that didn't invite me in. For days leading up to that morning, I had sensed the subtle shifts, the way the pantry door was locked tighter, the suspicious glances when I reached for a snack, the hushed phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. It was as if I had become a problem to be managed rather than a mother or grandmother to be loved. The betrayal was not a single act, but a slow unraveling, a tightening noose woven from small exclusions and silent erasures. Yet this morning's rationing was the moment it became undeniable. They starved me all day, not just of food, but of dignity, of recognition, of the basic kindness a family owes its own. After breakfast, I retreated to the living room, clutching my thin sweater tighter around my frail frame. The sun streamed weakly through the curtains, casting patterns of light and shadow across the faded carpet. And I let myself listen to the sounds of their lives moving on without me. The laughter of children, the click of dishes, the murmur of voices in the kitchen, all carried a note of exclusion, a reminder that I was no longer part of the chorus, but an echo fading into the background. I thought of my own mother, of how she had fed us through wars and winters, how she had held her family together with the strength of her hands and the warmth of her heart. And here I was, starved in my own home, made to feel as though I were a guest at best, a burden at worst. I remember the afternoon when the final line was crossed. It was late, the sun dipping low behind the trees, and I had sat quietly in my chair, watching the shadows lengthen. My daughter came in with a small notebook in hand, her eyes scanning a list she had clearly been updating with meticulous care. She glanced at me and said, "I'm keeping track of everything, Mom. It's for your health, to make sure you get what you need without overdoing it." The words stung because I knew they were true and false all at once. They were keeping track, yes, but not to nurture or protect, to ration and restrict. The pantry was no longer a place of nourishment, but a vault I was barred from opening. I understood then that my hunger was not for food alone, but for freedom, for respect, for the right to decide what I consumed and when. The betrayal was in the withholding, in the control wielded with a veneer of concern that barely concealed its cruelty. That night, I lay awake in the spare room they had given me, a place so stripped of warmth and memory it felt more like a holding cell than a home. The thin blanket offered little comfort against the chill that crept into my bones. I thought about the meals I had prepared for them over the years, the countless dinners where I had fed their children before my own hunger was acknowledged. I thought about the groceries I had bought with my own money, the food I had insisted on buying organic and fresh, only to have my appetite questioned and my portions limited now that I was the one at the table. I thought about the dog I had rescued from the neighbor's neglect, the way his eyes looked at me with a quiet trust, and I wondered how long it would be before I was left to starve completely, unnoticed and unheard. The realization settled like a stone in my gut. I was being erased, my needs diminished until they were no longer visible, until I was nothing more than a shadow in the family portrait. In the days that followed, the subtle exclusions grew louder. Meals were smaller, conversations passed over my head, and the locked pantry became a symbol of my diminished place. I watched as they organized their lives without me, deciding what I could eat, when I could rest, even how I should behave. The betrayal was total, yet it wore the mask of normalcy. No one raised their voice, no one accused, no one apologized. It was the slow strangulation of love, the quiet violence of a family that had decided I was no longer a priority, that my hunger was a problem to be managed rather than a call to be answered. Yet amid the pain, something inside me began to stir. The hunger they imposed became a catalyst for something else, a refusal, a spark of rebellion. If they would starve me, I would find another way to feed myself. If they denied me their table, I would build my own. If they could erase me from their lives, I would reclaim myself piece by piece, meal by meal, breath by breath. The day they rationed my food was the day I began to hunger for freedom, for agency, for a life not defined by exclusion, but by choice. And with that, hunger came a quiet determination, a resolve that would carry me far beyond the walls of that house and the shadow of their neglect. I remember the look on my daughter's face when she confronted me after finding the dog food missing from the pantry, the accusation sharp and disbelieving. "You gave food to a stray while you starved in our home," she said, voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. I told her simply, "I have been hungry every day here. I fed the dog because he needed it, because I needed to give something to someone." Her eyes flashed with something like fury, but I held my ground. That moment was a turning point. The unmasking of the betrayal, the acknowledgement that what I endured was no accident, no misunderstanding, but a deliberate choice made by those I once trusted. From that day, I knew I could no longer wait for their kindness or their recognition. I had to take what was mine, to find nourishment where they refused to give it. The catalyst that starved me all day was the moment I understood that survival was no longer about endurance alone, but about reclaiming my right to be seen, to be fed, to be loved. It was the beginning of a journey away from neglect and toward freedom, a journey marked by quiet acts of resistance and the fierce assertion of self. In the face of starvation, I found a hunger for life, a hunger that no one could take away. After that morning, when I was handed a bowl of thin soup instead of the warm meal I once expected, I began to notice how the quiet control around me tightened like a noose, closing in inch by inch until I was left gasping in a world that no longer recognized my presence. It wasn't a sudden plunge into cruelty, but a slow, creeping erosion of my place at the table and in their hearts. The pantry door was locked more often now, and when I asked about it, I was told it was for my own good, that they were keeping track of what I ate, watching my portions, making sure I didn't overindulge or undo the progress the doctor had so kindly prescribed. The spreadsheet my daughter kept, hidden in a notebook she carried everywhere, became the silent judge of my appetite. Every granola bar I took, every bite I dared to eat outside their schedule was noted and quietly admonished. I remember one evening, sitting in the kitchen as the shadows grew long and the house grew quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant murmur of television voices from the living room. My granddaughter, barely 10, mimicked her mother's voice with a cruel precision I could hardly bear to hear. "Grandma doesn't need dessert," she said, her words dripping with the same tone I had come to dread. She had her time. No one corrected her. No one stopped to ask if I heard or if it hurt. I sat frozen, my hands trembling slightly, as the echo of those words sank into me like a stone sinking slowly to the bottom of a well. It was a quiet cruelty, one that whispered not just to me, but to the whole household, that I was no longer deserving of the sweetness of life or the comfort of small joys. I began to shrink inside myself, withdrawing into the shadows of the house where my presence was tolerated but never welcomed. The locked pantry was more than just a barrier to food. It was a symbol of the walls being built around me, of the trust being withheld as surely as the keys to that door. My daughter's meticulous record-keeping was a daily reminder that my autonomy was slipping further away. It wasn't enough that I was no longer allowed to choose my own meals. Now, even the moments I was permitted to eat were regimented and scrutinized. The food I once prepared with care for my family was now rationed like medicine, measured out in portions that felt more like punishment than nourishment. I watched as the table was set each evening with meals I had no part in creating, dishes I was only allowed to taste with a fraction of the appetite I once had. The warmth of family dinners had turned cold, the laughter and conversation veiled by an undercurrent of exclusion. One particular afternoon, I found myself alone in the kitchen, the lingering smell of boiled vegetables and stale bread filling the air. I opened the refrigerator slowly, hoping to find something familiar, something that belonged to me. But the shelves were filled with containers labeled with names I didn't recognize, portions neatly divided into plastic boxes, each marked with a date and a strict calorie count. I reached for a small container of mashed potatoes, but my hand trembled and I hesitated. It wasn't just hunger I was feeling. It was the weight of being managed, controlled, observed like a patient rather than a mother. I closed the fridge quietly, the soft click of the door sounding like a final punctuation on a sentence I didn't want to finish. The house itself began to feel like a place I no longer belonged, the walls echoing with conversations that left me out, the furniture arranged in ways that made me feel like a guest rather than family. I stopped going to the family room in the evenings, choosing instead to retreat to my small bedroom, where the silence was less painful than the hollow warmth of the main floor. The presence of my own things dwindled. The photos I had brought with me remained packed in a box, unopened, as if the memories they held were too fragile to face alongside the cold reality of my daily life. My role had shifted from caregiver and nurturer to observer and shadow. Someone to be seen but not heard. Someone to be managed but never embraced. The constant watchfulness became suffocating. I caught glimpses of whispered conversations as I passed by rooms, the hushed tones falling silent when I entered, the subtle exchange of glances that spoke volumes in their absence of words. My daughter's phone calls were brief and businesslike, the warmth I had known in her voice years ago replaced by a careful distance. My son-in-law avoided eye contact, his presence in the house measured and deliberate, like a man navigating a minefield of unspoken tensions. The children grew accustomed to my absence, their questions about me fading into silence, as they learned that Grandma was someone who stayed in her room, ate what was given, and didn't ask for more. In those quiet moments, I found myself reaching for small comforts. A cup of tea made just the way I liked it. A worn sweater that smelled faintly of home. A book whose pages held the promise of escape. But even these were tinged with sadness. Reminders of a life that had slipped through my fingers like sand. I thought often about the dog who came to my window each afternoon. A scruffy mutt with wary eyes and a gentle soul. He was the one constant in my days, the one creature who didn't judge or measure my worth by the food I ate or the role I played. I began slipping bits of leftover rice, cheese, and scraps through the window for him, feeding him as if I were feeding a part of myself that had been starved too long. This small act of kindness became a lifeline, a way to reclaim some semblance of agency in a world that had shrunk around me. Despite the growing isolation, I held on to moments of quiet rebellion. I resisted the urge to disappear completely, to give in to the slow erasure that threatened to consume me. I kept a journal hidden beneath my mattress, where I wrote down memories, dreams, and small plans for a life that might one day be mine again. I found solace in the routines I created. The morning walk to the corner store, the slow folding of laundry, the ritual of feeding the dog. These acts, though small, reminded me that I was still here, still capable of choosing, still worthy of care and respect. Yet, the escalation of control was relentless. The locked pantry became the battleground where trust was broken and my will tested. I was accused quietly of hoarding or sneaking food, of being ungrateful or difficult. The accusations were never loud, but their impact was profound. Each one chipped away at my confidence, making me question my own judgment and the validity of my needs. I was made to feel as though I were the problem, the obstacle to the harmony of the household. But beneath the surface, a quiet fury grew. Not one of anger, but of determination. Determination to find a way out, to reclaim my dignity, to feed myself in every sense of the word. As the days turned into weeks, the lines between love and cruelty blurred, and I realized that the greatest violence I endured was not the withholding of food alone, but the withholding of my humanity. I was being starved not only of nourishment, but of presence, of voice, of choice. The first escalation was a test of endurance, a crucible in which I learned the depths of my own strength and the limits of their compassion. And in that learning, I began to see a path forward. A path that led away from the locked pantry and the whispered accusations toward a life I would build on my own terms. There came a day when I realized waiting was no longer an option. The quiet oppression that had settled over my life was like a slow storm, pressing me down until the weight became unbearable. It was not a sudden awakening, but a gradual unfolding, a soft crack in the wall of silence I had built around myself. I found myself lingering longer in the garage where the dog food was kept, a small, locked room at the back of the house I was barely allowed to enter. The cans of stew, marked with fancy labels like with bone marrow or premium organic, were meant for the purebred retriever that belonged to the neighbors, a dog pampered and adored, the center of their world. But somehow, this scruffy mutt that waited by my window had found his way to me, his eyes full of cautious trust, and in feeding him, I fed a part of myself that had been starving far longer than my body. It started as a simple act, almost accidental. I opened one of the tins quietly, careful to make no noise that might betray me, and I spooned out a portion, setting it gently into a small dish I had found in the corner of the kitchen. The dog was hesitant at first, but hunger outweighed fear, and he ate with a hunger that mirrored my own. Feeding him became my secret ritual, a small rebellion against the silence and control that had defined my days. It was more than just food. It was an act of love, of connection, of reclaiming agency in a world where I had been told to be small, to eat less, to disappear. I began to slip bits of cheese, scraps of bread, and little treats to him whenever I could, hiding the evidence in my coat pockets, sharing what was denied to me. In those moments, the dog was not just a stray, but a companion, a witness to my refusal to be broken by neglect. His presence reminded me that survival was not only about endurance, but about finding nourishment in unexpected places, about the power of small acts to reclaim what has been lost. Feeding him was feeding myself, a quiet affirmation that I was still here, still fighting, still deserving of care. This shift in my daily routine sparked something deeper within me. I began to imagine a life beyond the locked doors and whispered judgments, a life where I could choose what and when to eat, where I could be seen and heard without apology. The act of feeding the dog was a small step, but it was the first step toward reclaiming my independence. It was a crack in the cage that held me, a sign that I was beginning to break free from the invisible chains of control. I started to take more walks in the neighborhood, using the excuse of needing fresh air or a change of scenery, but really seeking out places where I could breathe freely, where no one monitored my movements or my appetite. Each step was a quiet defiance, a way to remind myself that the world was larger than the confines of that house, larger than the hunger I had endured. I noticed the small kindnesses along the way. A neighbor's nod, the scent of blooming flowers, the warmth of the sun on my face. These simple moments became anchors, grounding me in a reality that was mine to shape. At night, I found myself writing in a small journal I had purchased with the last of my savings, pouring out the feelings that had no place in conversation. I wrote about the hunger, the loneliness, the quiet betrayals, but also about hope, about dreams of a life where I could feed not just my body, but my spirit. The act of writing was a form of healing, a way to reclaim my voice when the world had tried to silence me. It was in these pages that I began to plan, not with grand gestures, but with small, manageable steps. Finding a room to rent, looking for work, imagining a space where I could be fully myself again. One evening, when the house was silent except for the ticking clock, I found myself standing before the locked pantry, my fingers tracing the cold metal of the latch. For so long, it had been a barrier, a symbol of what was withheld from me, both literally and figuratively. But now it was a challenge, a puzzle to be solved. I realized that the lock was not just on the door, but on my own will, and that to open it, I had to first unlock the belief that I was worthy of nourishment and freedom. I began quietly gathering what I could: coins saved from small allowances, a card I had kept hidden, a number for a local room to rent I had seen on a bulletin board. I made calls in the quiet hours when no one was listening, asking questions, making appointments, planting the seeds of a new life. Each step required courage. Each decision was a reclaiming of agency that had been denied for too long. The process was slow, sometimes discouraging, but it was mine. Feeding the dog had been my first act of defiance, but it was also a beacon guiding me forward. It reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there is a way to nurture life, even if it begins with a stray. I began to understand that survival is not simply about enduring what is done to you, but about finding ways to respond, to resist, to build anew. This was the shift, from victim to actor, from silence to voice, from starvation to nourishment. The quiet strength I found in these small acts began to ripple outward. I started to see possibilities where before there had been only walls. I imagined a place where I could cook my own meals, fill my days with work that mattered, and rest without fear of judgment. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt open. I was beginning to walk toward a life that was not defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I was choosing to reclaim. In the reflection of the window one evening, I saw not just an old woman, but a woman awakening, a woman who had survived hunger of many kinds and was ready to feed herself again. The path was still long, but the first steps had been taken, and with each one, the lock on the pantry seemed less like a barrier and more like a challenge waiting to be overcome. The days after my small acts of defiance began to ripple outward were marked not by relief, but by confrontation, by the heavy return of the past bearing down on me like an unrelenting tide. It was as if my decision to reclaim some part of myself was a provocation, a threat that could not be ignored or forgiven so easily. The calm I had begun to build around feeding the dog, stepping outside the boundaries set for me, was shattered by the sudden, sharp intrusion of their anger and control. They found out. Or perhaps they never really needed to find out. Perhaps they were always watching, waiting for the moment I dared to step beyond the silence they had imposed. I was caught one evening, as the sun dipped low and the house grew quiet in the twilight. I had slipped into the garage once again, that locked sanctuary where the dog food was kept, and quietly spooned out a portion of the stew I had come to cherish. The one with the bone marrow, the kind they bought for their precious retriever. I set it down gently on a small dish, hoping the dog would come quickly, that no one would notice. But this time, a shadow fell across the doorway. A camera, hidden and watching, had caught me in the act. It was an invasion, a betrayal of trust I had not even dared to offer. They watched me through that lens, not with empathy, but with suspicion, with a readiness to condemn. Later, at the dinner table, the footage was played back, not in private, but as a spectacle. A trial where I was the accused and they the jury. My daughter's voice was sharp, trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief as she confronted me. "You lied to us," she said, eyes narrowing. You gave food to a mutt while we were budgeting to keep you healthy. Do you have any idea what that means?" I met her gaze steadily, my own voice quiet but firm. "I've been hungry every day in this house," I said simply, the words hanging heavy in the air. "I fed the dog because he needed it, because I needed to give something to someone." The silence that followed was colder than any rebuke. No one looked at me. No one spoke. It was as if I had been stripped not only of my dignity but of the right to be heard. That confrontation marked a turning point, not in their attitudes, which hardened, but in my own resolve. The second escalation was not just a resurgence of control, but a full-throated attempt to push me back into the shadows, to silence the small light I had begun to kindle within myself. They brought up every small fault, every perceived transgression, twisting my need for food and connection into evidence of deceit and ingratitude. The locked pantry became a fortress, guarded not just by keys, but by accusation and shame. I was made to feel a criminal for the simplest acts of survival, for the instinct to nurture that had refused to be extinguished. Amid this, I received a letter. It was unexpected, coming in the middle of the storm, and it was from my youngest grandson, Kieran, the one who had never stopped visiting, who had always seen me as more than a shadow or a problem to be managed. His handwriting was familiar, full of nervous loops and careful spacing, the same way his mother had written when she was his age. In his letter, he asked gently, "Grandma, where are you? We miss you. Please tell me you're okay." There was no accusation in his words, no demand for explanation, only the quiet yearning of a child who still hoped for connection. I read the letter twice, tracing the lines with trembling fingers, and for a moment, I felt the warmth of being remembered, being wanted. But even as that warmth touched me, the past surged forward in other forms. My daughter, Lisa, showed up one day at the cafe where I had begun working, her presence a mixture of confrontation and fragile apology. She was dressed in a tailored coat, her expression unreadable, and when she spoke, her voice was low and guarded. "We thought you were behind us at the airport," she said, referring to the day they had left me waiting in the lounge. "We panicked. The kids were cranky. We didn't mean to hurt you." I listened, the words washing over me like cold water. 8 hours of waiting, 8 hours of silence. She didn't mention the hours, the waiting, the knowing they had left me behind intentionally. She only offered the excuse of panic and tired children, as if that could undo the sting of abandonment. I nodded slowly, not out of forgiveness, but to acknowledge the moment without surrendering my truth. "I didn't leave," I said simply. "You did." She pulled from her purse an envelope, one she said was for my grandson, Kieran. "He was struggling," she said, "and they wanted to help." I took the envelope, not because I wanted what was inside, but because refusing it outright would have been another kind of surrender. "He doesn't need a go-between," I told her. "He knows how to call." The conversation ended there, a fragile truce that held only as long as it had to. Her eyes were tired, her defenses slipping for a moment, and she whispered, "I wasn't trying to replace you. I just didn't want your shadow in every room." That was perhaps the closest thing to honesty I had heard from her in years. The escalation did not stop there. The local paper ran an article about my disappearance, a front-page story that painted me as a vulnerable woman who had vanished without a trace, leaving a worried family behind. Quotes from my son and daughter-in-law were full of concern and fear. But beneath their words, I heard the faint echo of possession, the need to control the narrative, to frame me as a victim rather than an agent of my own life. The article was a reminder that the past was not only present, but persistent, that the family who had tried to erase me now sought to claim me in their image as a fragile, lost woman in need of rescue. Legal pressure soon followed. A lawyer arrived at the cafe representing Adam and Lisa with carefully worded requests about my well-being and assets. They wanted to ensure I was in a safe environment, to discuss next steps, euphemisms for taking back control, for reeling me in under their terms. I looked at the man, calm and steady, and told him plainly, "Tell Adam and Lisa I'm not a pet. They forgot to pick me up, and there are no next steps unless I take them." His eyes flickered, caught off guard by my resolve. I walked past him and out the door, leaving behind the shadow of the family I had known and the control they still tried to wield. Arthur, the man who had become my friend at the cafe, was waiting outside. He didn't ask about the lawyer or the family's attempts to reclaim me. He simply asked, "You okay?" And I answered with the truth I was just beginning to own. Yes, because I'm not going to let anyone convince me I'm not. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar noise of the city and the quiet presence of a friend, I felt a strength I hadn't known I still possessed. The second escalation was a reckoning, a collision between the life I was choosing and the life they tried to force upon me. It was painful and exhausting, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but it was also the crucible in which my new self was forged. I learned that standing firm meant saying no to the past, to the control, to the silencing. It meant accepting the loneliness that came with breaking free and embracing the uncertain freedom that lay ahead. Amid the turmoil, the small gestures of connection with Kieran remained my anchor. His calls were cautious but genuine, a bridge between the family I was leaving behind and the life I was building. When he visited, we talked of simple things: birds, books, the weather, conversations stripped of blame and expectation. He never asked me to return, and I never asked him to stay. We understood that our bond was fragile but precious, a thread of love that survived despite everything. The second escalation was not just a battle with family, but a fight for my very identity. It was the moment when I chose myself over their narratives, when I declared that I would not be diminished or controlled any longer. It was the painful but necessary storm before the calm, the breaking of old ties to make way for new growth. And in the midst of it all, I held on to the quiet hope that one day I would find peace. Not in their acceptance, but in my own reclaiming of life and love on my own terms. The moment came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic announcement, but it carried the weight of a lifetime pressed into a single act. After months of being controlled, watched, diminished, and dismissed, I finally took a step that was both terrifying and liberating. I sent a letter, not to my family, not to those who had tried to own my life and dictate my every move, but to the lawyer who had come with demands dressed as concern. The letter was brief, measured, and firm. It was a declaration that I was no longer theirs to control, a boundary drawn in ink that could not be erased or ignored. I wrote that I was of sound mind, living in a safe environment, and not under duress. I informed them that I had retained local legal counsel and that any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I signed it with a steady hand and mailed it the next morning, feeling the finality of that act settle into my bones. That letter was not just paper and ink. It was a reclaiming of my voice, my autonomy, and my dignity. It was the culmination of all the small rebellions, the quiet defiance of feeding a stray dog, the refusal to be starved or silenced, the steadfast refusal to return to the shadows of neglect. It was the moment I took control of my story, refusing to be written into a narrative of victimhood or pity. Sending that letter was a way of saying, I am here, whole and unbroken, and I will no longer be a part of your script. It was the sharp, clean cut of a tether severed, the final boundary that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The days after I sent the letter were filled with a strange mix of silence and anticipation. The calls and messages that had flooded my phone slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether. The legal threats and veiled concerns fell away like dead leaves in autumn, leaving a quiet that was not empty, but full of possibility. I began to feel a lightness I had not known in years, a lifting of the weight that had pressed on my chest and dimmed my spirit. I was still cautious, still aware that the past could reach out again, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. A fragile but real peace that came from standing firm and choosing myself. The letter was not the only act of reclamation that marked this climax. I also sent a brief note to Lisa, my daughter-in-law, a woman who had played a central role in the denial of my dignity and the control of my life. The note was short but clear. I told her that I knew what she had done and what she had left unsaid. I said I was not angry, but that I was not coming back. I wished her well and told her to take care of her own life now, because I was finally starting mine. Sending that note was an act of closure, a way to release the anger and disappointment that had built up over years, and to step into a future where I was no longer bound by their expectations or judgments. That evening, as I sat on the porch of the small house I now called home, wrapped in a quilt and watching the moon rise, I felt the truth of what I had done settle around me like a warm embrace. The night was calm, the air cool and soft, and the world seemed to hold its breath with me. I was not the woman they had tried to make me. Invisible, silent, compliant. I was someone new, someone who had endured hunger in many forms and had chosen to feed herself instead. The act of writing those letters, of sending them out into the world, was not just about ending old ties, but about affirming a new identity, one grounded in self-respect, resilience, and hope. In the days that followed, I began to see the tangible fruits of that choice. Heather, the young woman who ran the cafe where I worked, offered me extra shifts without asking, recognizing the steady presence I had become. Arthur, my quiet friend, who had stood by me through so much, came in one day looking tired but steady, and we shared a moment of understanding without the need for many words. "You look lighter," he said simply. I smiled and told him about the letter, the one I had written and sent, the one that marked the turning point. He nodded, saying, "Sometimes it's the unsent ones that change everything. Sometimes it's the ones you send without waiting for a reply." His words stayed with me, a reminder that not all acts of courage are loud or public, but that they carry power nonetheless. At home, the house smelled of garlic and simmering sauce, the simple comfort of a meal prepared with care and without fear. Franklin, the cat who had adopted me, curled up in my lap, purring softly, as if he understood the quiet triumph of this moment. Joyce, my roommate and friend, looked up from her knitting and smiled, saying, "You look smug again." I laughed, a full, genuine laugh that surprised me with its ease. It was the laugh of a woman who had faced down years of neglect and had come out the other side, stronger, and more whole. That night, as I wrote in my journal, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The hunger, the betrayal, the small acts of defiance, the moments of despair and hope. I wrote about the power of saying no, of setting boundaries, of choosing oneself even when it feels impossible. I wrote about the freedom that comes from reclaiming one's voice and the peace that follows when the past is no longer allowed to define the present. The climax of my story was not a single dramatic event, but a series of quiet, determined choices that added up to a life reclaimed. In sending those letters, I had not only closed a door, but opened a window to a new world. One where I was no longer waiting for permission or forgiveness, where I could feed my body and soul without shame, and where I could live fully and freely on my own terms. It was the moment I stepped out of the shadows and into the light of my own making, the moment I stopped being a ghost in my own life and became a woman who had learned to stand tall again. The days after the letters were sent settled into a new rhythm, quiet but alive with possibility. I found myself waking not to the weight of expectation or the sting of exclusion, but to a calmness that was unfamiliar and yet deeply needed. Living alone in that small, rented room, with Mercy curled at my feet and the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, I began to feel the edges of my life soften in a way that was not surrender, but acceptance. Acceptance of myself, my history, and the life I was determined to build. There was no grand revelation or triumphant declaration, only the steady unfolding of a life reclaimed piece by piece. One of the most profound moments came in a letter from Kieran, my grandson, who had never stopped reaching out. His words were simple, but full of meaning, a bridge across the years and wounds that still lingered. He told me he was coming to visit, that he wanted to see me without the shadows of the past looming between us. When he arrived, we met quietly, not needing to fill the silence with explanations or apologies. We spoke of small things, the changing seasons, the books we were reading, the birds that visited the garden. There was no rush, no pressure, only the gentle rebuilding of a connection that was fragile but precious. In his eyes I saw a reflection of the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. And it was enough. Life took on a new shape in those weeks and months. I settled into my work at the cafe, where the rhythm of mornings and the steady flow of customers gave me a sense of purpose and belonging. Heather, who had once been a stranger, became a friend who saw me not as a relic of the past, but as a woman still capable of growth and contribution. Arthur, with his quiet presence and shared understanding, became a companion in this new chapter. Not a rescue, but a partnership grounded in mutual respect and kindness. These relationships were not the grand gestures of stories told in books, but the small, steady currents that carried me forward. I found joy in simple pleasures. A warm cup of tea in the morning, the feel of my hands working dough as I baked a cake, the softness of a wool coat that I had chosen for myself, a symbol of the dignity I was reclaiming. The world was no longer a place of hunger and exclusion, but one where I could feed not only my body, but my spirit. I began to bake lemon squares for the community potluck, an event I had never imagined myself attending. And in sharing those sweets, I shared a piece of my story, my survival, and my hope. The past, with all its pain and betrayal, did not disappear. It lingered like a shadow at the edge of the day, a reminder of what had been endured and overcome. But it no longer defined me. I learned that healing is not about forgetting or erasing, but about embracing the whole of one's life with compassion and courage. I kept the letters I had written, not as weapons or shields, but as milestones marking the journey from silence to voice, from hunger to nourishment, from invisibility to presence. One evening, as I sat on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching the moon rise over the quiet neighborhood, I wrote a letter to myself. It was a letter of affirmation and love, a reminder of the strength I had found and the journey I had taken. I told myself that I had waited too long for someone to save me, that I had forgotten I was always the one holding the key. I reminded myself that I had not lost them. It was they who had let go, and now I was finally letting go in return. I taped the letter to the inside of my dresser drawer, a secret reminder to carry with me whenever doubt crept in. The life I built was not grand or dramatic, but it was real and whole. It was a life of quiet moments and steady steps, of small victories and deep resilience. I learned that freedom is not always loud or public, but often found in the soft spaces where one dares to be oneself. I learned that love and respect begin with oneself, and that choosing to nourish one's own spirit is the first act of true rebellion. If my story finds you in a moment of silence or struggle, know this: you do not have to wait for permission or a perfect sign to choose yourself. You are not alone in feeling unseen or unheard, but you have the power to be your own sign, your own noise in the silence, your own step away from the places that diminish you. When you find your way back to yourself, come back and tell me. I will be here, listening, waiting, and believing in the strength that lives inside every woman who has been told she must be small.